bring this point to attention that there is a demand problem for employment as well. And I would like to take some of the pressure of the blame on students away from them and say that the demand for jobs is low and declining. Just to give you an idea, the growth in net fixed assets of the corporate sector in the last 4 to 5 years, 5 years or more, has been in single digits. In 2021, no, in 21-22, listed companies, these are bigger companies, reported a net fixed assets growth of 2.5% in nominal terms. That means there were no jobs for us, no new jobs for us. That's terrible. So I think there is a need for us to also recognize, I'm not telling you what the policy people should be doing. My concern is more to do with the mental health and stress of students who come under pressure that they are not good enough in the job. The problem is that there ain't enough jobs out there. That's what's leading to falling labor participation rate. So in youngsters, the labor participation rate is lower than the normal labor participation rate, and their unemployment rate is much higher. So which means that there is tremendous stress in the youth of the country, and I think we can skill them more, we can prepare our education system, but so long as we don't generate enough jobs, we have a bigger challenge at hand. That's what I will conclude with.
So let me start by responding to thanks for saying that some of the points I said were relevant. I it's connected to Mahesh's point also. National Skill Development Council often says that आप बोल रहे हैं देश में स्किल नहीं है, but how much is a company paying for a skilled person? And in fact, it's not paying the premium. नहीं आपको स्किल दे दिया, आप जाइए जॉब मार्केट में, बोल रहे इतना डेस्परेट है कि स्किल नहीं है, पर स्किल के लिए पैसे देने को तैयार भी नहीं है. So of course, the demand side is definitely more important. But I don't think that sitting and hoping for demand will bring demand. And I think that is where I think this is important कि मैं राजस्थान में बोल रहा हूँ, यहाँ पे business community काफी large है. I think अब टाइम आ गया है कि हम सर्विस सेक्टर जहाँ पे नौकरियाँ हैं, ये जो सेफ ऑप्शन का मेंटालिटी हमारे काफ़ी कम्युनिटीज़ में है, एंड आई एम टॉकिंग एज अ बंगाली, हमारे यहाँ पे तो सब नौकरी ढूंढते हैं, ये आई थिंक दैट अब ये सस्टेनेबल नहीं है. एक टाइम था जब हमें लगा था कि बहुत सारे कंपनीज अचानक ग्रो करेंगे, सर्विस सेक्टर ग्रो करेगा, आईटी में ग्रोथ तो हो गया, अब सैचुरेशन आ रहा है. सो आई थिंक दैट at some point आप लोगों को रिस्क थोड़ा लेना पड़ेगा. This is the only thing I would like to say in conclusion, that आप वेट मत कीजिए कि company jobs will come to you, especially for women. This is very important advice, because it's not easy. There are enough research that shows that the discrimination जो labor market में है, नौकरियों में है, ये काफ़ी हाई है. आप ज्वाइन भी करेंगे तो एविडेंस दिखाता है कि आप 10 साल में आप यू बी आउट ऑफ इट, बिकॉज ऑफ वेरियस रीजन, नॉट बिकॉज कि आप नहीं करना चाहते. कभी इट विल नॉट बी सेफ, समटाइम्स इट विल बी फार ऑफ, समटाइम्स देयर विल बी यू विल नॉट बी पैली विद द मेल बॉसेस, जबकि आपका प्रमोशन नहीं होगा. रिसर्च शोज दैट दीज आर द रीजंस व्हाई वुमेन आर ड्रॉपिंग ऑफ. ऐसे नहीं है कि लाइक दे जस्ट डोंट वांट टू वर्क. तो अगर आप वो ही मॉडल पे चलेंगे तो आई डू नॉट सी कि ये बहुत चेंज होने वाला है. An entrepreneurship model, maybe even household based, if that be the reality of India in the short run, is probably for women the more likely option. I'm not saying it's the most desirable option. I don't think it's the most desirable option, but it's the more likely option. For sure, entrepreneurship, I think, is something that will fuel India's growth through higher education. And I think that's the way you should think moving forward, and not just think about a job.
So I'm going to make 3 sets of points in my closing. First is about hope. Keeping hope. And I think we have good reasons to believe that we can and should have hope. That we can. Our economy has created jobs in the past at a much faster rate than young people are joining the labor force. And we can still do that. Let me give you some numbers. Between 2004, 5 and 12, the economy was growing at 8% per annum, which is unprecedented in the history of our country. We were growing at 8% per annum. We were generating, believe it or not, 7.5 million new non-farm jobs every year. 7.5 million new non-farm jobs were being created each year over that period. We were lucky in that period that many youngsters were still in school and were not joining the labor force, but that's besides the point. The more important point to remember is that if you grow it at least 8%, somewhat not dissimilar to the Chinese growth rate, and we've done it before, so we can do it again. We need to have confidence, but we need to have the right strategy. Unfortunately, in the last 7 or 8 years, we haven't had that right strategy. I'll come back to that in a minute. So keep hope. It's possible to do because we've done it before. We are not, as compared to the 7.5 million new non-farm jobs that were being generated over that 7 or 8 year period when we were growing at an unprecedented growth rate in our economy. Compared to that, in the last 8 years, we've been generating only 2.9 million new non-farm jobs. Before COVID, I'm saying, not including COVID. In COVID, jobs have been lost, as I'm sure my good friend Mahesh would have talked at some length about. We're really grateful to him that he has been documenting this, and we use his data precisely for this reason, documenting how the situation evolved over COVID. So I'm saying before COVID, between 2013 and 2019, we were generating only 2.9 million jobs, 29 million jobs per annum, as opposed to 2.9 million jobs per annum as opposed to 7.5 million jobs per annum. Why? Because the growth rate fell. You understand how important growth rates are to generating new non-farm jobs. So we need to be focused on getting growth right. But there are many other things that we need to be focused on in order to generate that kind of growth and generate jobs as well. One thing that, and I'm coming to my second point. As we were growing fast, over that period we were on a trajectory of structural transformation. What is development all about? What is it this Vyas that we keep wanting, all of us? What we really want is essentially 3 things. What we are looking for, and that's what Kuznets spoke about, that's the kind of transformation that economists have spoken about. What are they? One, a rise in per capita income, but what is it driven by? It's driven by a fall in the share of agriculture in employment and in GDP, and a rise in the share of industry and in services. Because the productivity in industry is higher than in agriculture, the productivity of services is higher than in agriculture. Therefore, you want employment in industry and in services, and contribution of agriculture has to fall simultaneously, and the contribution of agriculture in not just GDP but in employment has to fall. Simultaneously, the contribution of industry and services, especially manufacturing within industry, needs to grow. That's what Vyas is supposed to do. But this means not just services growth or modern services growth, because modern services are the only sector in the economy which have been generating non-farm jobs, unfortunately. We cannot continue along that path, regardless of what Raghuram Rajan tells us. Yes, Raghuram Rajan has been saying in recent months that we should be focusing a little bit more on services exports, and I think I agree with him, but unfortunately he's being misinterpreted to understand that it doesn't matter whether we grow our manufacturing or not. Unfortunately, it is not being understood sufficiently by our policymakers in this country that while labor is the surplus factor, Abhiroop mentioned, capital is not the surplus factor of production in our economy. It's labor which is the surplus factor. We need to generate employment for workers in the non-farm sector. And how did the East Asian countries did it? How did China do it? They did it on the strength of manufacturing growth. And guess what has happened to manufacturing in the last several years? Between 1991 post-economic reforms, the contribution of manufacturing to GDP used to be 17%. It wasn't growing. We would have liked it to grow, but it wasn't growing. It was at least constant at 17%, all the way till 2015. Post-2016, the contribution of manufacturing fell to about 15% of GDP in 2019. Over the last 2 years, it has fallen even further. In other words, there's been deindustrialization happening. Not the growth of manufacturing. And despite Make in India, please try and understand. On the one hand, you have the Jumlebazi about Make in India, which is all about ease of doing business, which itself, what is ease of doing business? Rankings. The World Bank itself has abandoned it. Because the chief economist of the World Bank actually had very serious problems with the ease of doing business rankings. And finally, the World Bank abandoned it. तो हम जो हर साल अपने को खुद थपथपाते चले जा रहे थे कि देखिए ईज ऑफ डूइंग बिजनेस की रैंकिंग में हम कितने ऊंचे उड़ते चले जा रहे हैं, उड़ते हम धराशाही हो गए क्योंकि वो ईज ऑफ डूइंग बिजनेस रैंकिंग ही गायब कर दी वर्ल्ड बैंक। और उस समय भी हमको असलियत मालूम थी। असलियत क्या थी? क्योंकि वर्ल्ड बैंक की रैंकिंग्स हमारे देश की किस पे आधारित होती है? Only on surveying enterprises in 2 cities. आप बताएंगे कि वो कौन से 2 शहर हैं जहां वो वर्ल्ड बैंक सर्वे होते थे जिसके आधार पे भारत ईज ऑफ डूइंग बिजनेस में बढ़ता चला जा रहा? बताए कोई? बैंगलोर नहीं, मुंबई और दूसरा दिल्ली। अरे दिल्ली और मुंबई क्या भारत है? दिल्ली और मुंबई भारत तो नहीं है ना? कितनी इंडस्ट्री है दिल्ली और मुंबई में? Bottom line is manufacturing contribution to employment and to GDP has been falling, and the main reason why I would argue that this is a longer discussion that we run out of time to talk about. I've written about it. You can read this in a recent book of mine published by Penguin called Reviving Jobs, where essentially I say all the East Asian economies managed to raise manufacturing share of GDP and employment on a strength of industrial policy, on a strength of a manufacturing strategy, and on the strength, please understand, on the strength of education and vocational education strategy, which was aligned to the industrial policy. What about us? Since 1991, we haven't had an industrial policy in the first place. Forget about an education and a vocational strategy which is aligned to an industrial policy. You understand? So how are you going to get the labor-intensive manufacturing jobs which this country desperately needs? In the last 5 or 6 years, manufacturing employment in the labor-intensive sectors, which are 5: food processing, leather and footwear, garments, textiles, and food processing. These 5 sectors, wooden furniture, these 5 sectors account for 50% of total manufacturing employment in our country. There's been an absolute decline in these labor-intensive sectors. These account for half of all manufacturing employment. There's been an absolute decline. Despite Make in India, despite come Make in India, FDI बढ़ता चला जा रहा है। हाँ ठीक है, FDI बढ़ रहा है तो labor-intensive manufacturing क्यों नहीं बढ़ी भाई? आपको सवाल नहीं करना चाहिए क्या? करना चाहिए। तो हमारे मैनेजमेंट वाले स्टूडेंट्स जो हैं, क्यों IIT करेंगे, NIT से पास करेंगे, इंजीनियरिंग करेंगे, उसके बाद क्यों मैनेजमेंट करना चाहते हैं? क्यों? क्योंकि सारा फाइनेंस हो जाना चाहते हैं। अरे इंजीनियरिंग में क्यों नहीं जा रहे? इंजीनियरिंग पढ़ी 5 साल, हमने टैक्स पेयर मनी वहां जा रहा है हमारा, तो वहां क्यों नहीं जा रहे? जाएंगे क्योंकि नौकरी नहीं है। तरीके से नौकरी बढ़ेगी नहीं, नौकरी तब बढ़ेगी जब निवेश बढ़ेगा. That was my second one. And my final point, I think we haven't, I don't know to what extent it was discussed when I was not here, and which we need to worry about all of this. And this is related to the demographic dividend subject. I will close it. I think not many of us, either in this room or among our policy makers, are cognizant of the fact that 91% of our workforce is informal. What is an informal worker? An informal worker, unlike all the faculty in this room, are those who have no social insurance. What is social insurance? Informal workers, 91% of our workers, have no old age pension, they have no death and disability insurance, and they have no maternity benefit if they are living. 91%. This is not an acceptable situation as we move forward, as we